A sound beneath the snow was the only reason Jack Callahan stopped walking away. The morning on the Wyoming ridge was quiet enough to make a man believe nothing in the world was still alive. Jack stood near his horse, breath turning to vapor in the cold air, eyes fixed on a collapsed cabin half buried in drifted snow. He had seen broken structures before out on the plains, but something about this one held him there longer than reason should allow. The wind shifted, carrying a faint sound that did not belong to the open land. At first he thought it was the wind playing tricks on him, the way loneliness sometimes does in empty country. Then it came again, clearer this time, fragile but undeniable, pulling his attention straight down toward the broken cabin. Jack's hand tightened on the saddle as he stared, realizing the sound was not the wind at all. It was coming from under the wreckage. He dismounted slowly, boots sinking into the cold crust of snow, each step careful, deliberate, as if the ground itself might break under him. Jack moved toward the collapsed cabin, studying the warped wood and bent beams, trying to understand how something so solid had given way. Then he heard it again. This time there was no doubt. A baby was crying somewhere beneath the broken structure, faint but real, cutting through the silence like a thread of life refusing to disappear. Jack froze for a moment, the kind of stillness that comes when a man realizes the world has just changed without asking permission. He looked once toward the horizon, where no help was coming, then back at the cabin, where something still was. And in that silence, he made his decision. He stepped closer to the cabin, feeling the weight of every past choice that had led him to this frozen ridge, where the wind carried more questions than answers, and every plank of wood beneath the snow seemed to whisper that time was running out for whoever was still trapped below. He crouched near the broken foundation, placing one hand against the cold timber, listening closely as the faint sound became clearer, guiding him like a thread through the chaos of collapse and silence. Somewhere beneath the weight of shattered wood and frozen earth, life was still holding on, fragile but persistent, and Jack knew he could not turn away now even if the storm above him grew heavier by the minute. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself, then began clearing the first beam, careful not to disturb what lay beneath, moving with a patience born from years of solitude on land that never forgave mistakes. The wind picked up again, brushing across the ridge, and Jack glanced once more toward the empty horizon, knowing that if anyone was coming, they were still far enough away that every second now belonged only to him and to whoever was trapped under the broken cabin waiting for a chance to breathe again. He reached for the next piece of timber, jaw tight, eyes focused, aware that whatever waited beneath was no longer just a sound in the snow but a life hanging on the edge of silence, and there was no turning back from what he had started. Jack Callahan kept his hand on the timber for a moment longer, but something changed before he could move to the next beam. The sound from beneath the wreckage was no longer just random movement or fading echo, it had shape now, a rhythm that felt almost intentional, like someone was trying to reach him through the silence. He leaned closer, brushing snow off the broken edge, and that was when a voice finally broke through, faint but steady, telling him to stop. Jack froze, not because of fear, but because of clarity, the kind that comes when the world stops behaving like expectation. The voice belonged to a woman, close enough to be trapped beneath him but calm in a way that did not match the situation he had imagined seconds earlier. She told him not to move the larger beam above the center frame, her words slow, careful, as if she was measuring every breath to make sure it would carry. Jack hesitated, his hand hovering above the wood, realizing for the first time that this was not simply a collapse to be undone but something arranged in a way he did not yet understand. Beneath the fractured structure, Mary Whitaker pressed her back against what remained of the interior wall, holding her baby close, her eyes tracking every vibration through the beams. Above her. She was not pleading, not panicked, only focused, as if she had already survived the worst moment and was now managing what came after. Jack asked if she could move, but her answer was not what he expected. She said she could, but only if the wrong pieces were left untouched, because the cabin had fallen in a pattern that still held weight in places most people would miss. The wind shifted again across the ridge, and Jack caught something new in the distance, not a sound of urgency or chaos, but the steady approach of horses moving along the valley floor far below. He straightened slightly, scanning the horizon line where trees met sky, noticing that the movement was not random travel but organized, deliberate, and still too far away to identify clearly. Mary noticed his pause and asked if anyone was supposed to be looking for them, her voice quieter now, as if the question itself carried risk. Jack did not answer immediately, because the truth was that no one should have been coming at all, not here, not this far from the main road, not to a broken cabin no one had claimed in years. Instead, he focused on the structure again, but now with different intent, listening not just to wood and wind but to the way the space beneath responded, as if the cabin itself was holding information it had not yet given up. Mary finally added something that made him still completely, telling him she had not been alone when the storm hit, and that what brought them here was not an accident of weather but a decision made miles away before the snow ever began to fall. The words hung between them as the distant riders continued their slow approach, and Jack realized that whatever he had stepped into was no longer about pulling people from wreckage, but about understanding why they had been buried in the first place, and who might still be watching from beyond the ridge. The valley no longer felt like a place caught in an accident of weather, but like a place being quietly evaluated for ownership, and that realization changed how Jack Callahan carried himself as he stood between the broken cabin remains and the distant riders. The moment he stopped reacting and started observing, everything became more structured in his mind, as if he was finally reading a situation that had been speaking to him since the first sound under the snow. Mary Whitaker noticed the change in him immediately, not in his posture alone but in the way he no longer looked at the wreckage as something to fix, but as something to understand. The riders had not moved closer, yet their patience now felt heavier, almost like pressure rather than distance, and Jack understood that silence in situations like this was not absence of action but a form of control. What made everything sharper was that the collapse itself was no longer the center of the problem, it had become evidence inside a larger system he was only beginning to see. Mary finally admitted that the land beneath the cabin had been part of a disputed claim tied to an unfinalized transfer that had been circulating through county records for years, never fully settled because every attempt to confirm it had been delayed or redirected by people with influence in nearby towns. That detail did not create a new danger in the physical sense, but it changed the nature of the pressure entirely, because now every decision Jack made would not be judged as rescue or interference, but as participation in a legal conflict he never intended to enter. Jack felt the shift internally, recognizing that his earlier mistake had been assuming the crisis was about survival, when in reality it was about definition, about who had the authority to say what the situation even was. The riders finally began to move again, not toward him but along a wider arc that slowly enclosed the space without crossing it, and Jack realized they were no longer waiting for action but for interpretation, as if the next truth spoken would determine how the entire scene would be classified. Instead of trying to outmaneuver them physically, Jack adjusted his focus to clarity, asking Mary precise questions rather than reacting to fragments, forcing himself to separate what she feared from what she actually knew. This shift in him was not heroic or sudden, but deliberate, a correction born from earlier misunderstanding, and for the first time since. Arriving at the ridge, Jack understood that survival here would not depend on strength or speed, but on whether he could think more clearly than the people watching him from the valley below. Jack Callahan no longer looked at the valley as a single problem to solve, but as a layered system where every movement carried meaning beyond what the eye could immediately confirm. The riders had spread farther now, not closing in, not retreating, but reorganizing into positions that quietly reshaped the space around the cabin remains. It was not a blockade in the way Jack would have once understood it, but something more patient, something that turned observation itself into pressure. Mary Whitaker noticed it too, but instead of focusing on the riders, her attention shifted to the broken foundation beneath them, where exposed beams and collapsed earth revealed something Jack had overlooked in his earlier urgency. She asked him to look closer at the ground near the southern edge of the wreckage, where the snow had settled unevenly, as if something beneath it had changed the way it froze. Jack knelt, brushing away layers of ice and dirt, and discovered that part of the foundation had been reinforced differently from the rest, not as shelter but as concealment. That detail altered everything they thought they understood about why the cabin had been built here at all. It was no longer just a shelter that had failed under weight and weather, it had been positioned as a marker, something designed to sit on top of what was already hidden beneath the land. Mary's voice lowered as she explained that the land survey dispute was never about ownership in the simple sense, but about access to something recorded beneath old boundary lines, something that had been quietly passed through incomplete documentation for years until it became easier for certain parties to treat the structure as irrelevant rather than resolve what it actually represented. Jack listened without interrupting, but his focus was no longer on the cabin or even the riders. It was on the realization that his act of pulling her out had unintentionally exposed something that others had been willing to leave buried indefinitely. The riders shifted again, and this time their movement carried a different quality, not patience but confirmation, as if whatever they were waiting for had finally become visible enough to interpret. One of them raised a hand, not as a signal of approach, but as a signal to pause all movement across the valley, and that simple gesture changed the entire atmosphere. Jack understood then that the conflict was no longer about rescue, ownership, or even survival in the immediate sense, but about who had the authority to define what had just been uncovered. Mary looked at him and said nothing for several seconds, then admitted that the document tied to the land had never been missing, only deliberately misread in multiple filings, creating a gap between recorded truth and physical reality that someone had now chosen to close. Jack stood slowly, not because he had found a solution, but because he had finally recognized the structure of the pressure surrounding them. The situation was no longer reactive, it was procedural, shaped by interpretation rather than force. And as the wind moved across the ridge again, carrying the sound of distant hooves without urgency, Jack realized that every decision from this point forward would not change what had already happened, but determine who would be allowed to explain it. The wind across the valley shifted in a way that no longer felt natural, as if it had been redirected rather than simply moving through open land, and Jack Callahan noticed it the moment the riders stopped adjusting their positions and began holding still instead. That stillness was not hesitation, it was confirmation, and it changed everything he thought he understood about the situation beneath the broken cabin remains. Mary Whitaker tightened her grip on the baby, but her eyes were no longer fixed on the riders or even the wreckage, they were focused on something Jack had not yet considered, the administrative boundary markers partially exposed near the collapsed foundation. She told him quietly that the land itself was not the final asset anyone cared about, it was what the land had been used to validate, a recorded transfer tied to mineral rights that were never publicly disclosed, hidden in filings that only mattered when triggered by physical confirmation on site. Jack listened, but this time his understanding did not come from shock, it came from recognition of a pattern repeating in a different form, because what had begun as a rescue was now being interpreted as legal activation of dormant claims. The riders were no longer behaving like observers or enforcers of presence, they were behaving like witnesses to a threshold being crossed. Then something unexpected broke the pattern completely. A second group appeared along the opposite ridge line, moving at a different pace, less structured, more urgent, and their arrival forced the first group to adjust their formation without advancing. Jack immediately understood this was not escalation within a single conflict, but the collision of two competing interests arriving at the same truth from different directions. Mary went silent for a long moment before saying that neither group should have known about this location at the same time, which meant someone had released information that was supposed to remain sealed until legal review in the county office. Jack realized then that his earlier actions had not caused the conflict but had exposed it, like removing debris from a structure that was already under inspection by forces he never saw coming. The riders on both sides began signaling, not toward Jack, but toward each other, and for the first time the tension in the valley was no longer about survival or rescue, but about control of interpretation, about who had the authority to define what the uncovered site legally represented. Jack stepped slightly away from the cabin remains, not retreating but repositioning himself outside the center of attention, because he understood that being at the center now meant being used as evidence rather than participant. Mary watched both groups carefully and finally admitted that if the mineral claim beneath the land was verified through physical exposure, then ownership would not default to any individual present, but to the entity that could first legally register discovery under emergency land statutes. The baby stirred faintly in her arms as she said this, and the valley suddenly felt less like a rescue site and more like a contested record being rewritten in real time. Jack looked once at the broken structure, then at the opposing ridges, and understood that the next move would not decide who was saved, but who would be recognized as having the right to claim what saving had revealed. Jack Callahan did not move when the second group appeared anymore, not because he was calm, but because he finally understood that reacting too fast was exactly what the valley was designed to exploit. He stood slightly off-center from the wreckage, where neither ridge line could fully use him as a reference point, and that small adjustment came from a lesson he had only just learned: in conflicts that are not physical, visibility is a form of vulnerability. Mary Whitaker noticed the change in him immediately, but this time she did not ask him to act, she only followed his positioning, mirroring his distance from the center as if she was learning the same rule in real time. The opposing groups on the ridges had stopped signaling to each other and had begun signaling to unseen parties further down the valley, and that shift told Jack something important had changed again. The conflict was no longer local, it was being coordinated. Mary finally admitted something she had not said before, that the cabin site was not just tied to mineral rights or land claims, but had been flagged months earlier in an internal dispute between private survey contractors and a federal review hold that prevented any single party from finalizing ownership. Jack absorbed that without interrupting, but instead of treating it as another complication, he treated it as a map of pressure points, understanding now that whoever controlled information flow controlled the outcome more than whoever controlled the land itself. He made a different decision than before, not to protect the wreckage or the people immediately, but to prevent either group from isolating them as the only visible variable in the equation. Instead of staying near Mary and the baby, Jack moved deliberately toward a section of exposed survey markers at the edge of the collapse, placing himself in a position where his presence aligned with recorded boundary references rather than human interpretation. This was not instinct anymore, it was adaptation, a correction from his earlier mistake of treating the situation as rescue when it had always been jurisdiction. The riders on both ridges responded at once, not by advancing, but by recalculating, and Jack realized the most dangerous pressure was not force or distance, but being redefined by others without consent. Mary watched him and quietly said she understood now that survival here depended less on escaping danger and more on refusing to be positioned incorrectly within it. For the first time, Jack did not feel like a man reacting to a crisis, but like someone actively resisting classification, and that understanding changed the way he looked at everything in the valley, because now every movement was not about saving lives alone, but about preventing those lives from being turned into evidence by people who had never been seen. Jack Callahan remained still for several seconds after the valley shifted into a quieter kind of tension, not because nothing was happening, but because too many things were happening at once in ways that no longer belonged to physical space alone. The riders on both ridges were no longer acting like separate groups observing a claim, they were acting like extensions of a larger system that was now actively processing the location as a verified point of interest. Mary Whitaker noticed it first in the sound, not of hooves or wind, but of something distant and mechanical carrying faintly through the valley air, like structured communication replacing human judgment. Jack recognized his earlier mistake immediately in hindsight, which was assuming that positioning himself near survey markers would protect him from interpretation, when in reality it only made him easier to locate within a system that no longer relied on visual confirmation alone. Mary told him in a low steady voice that external confirmation had just been received, not from the riders, but from a remote verification authority tied to federal land reconciliation records, triggered by the exposure of boundary data at the collapse site. That single detail changed the entire nature of the conflict again, because now the valley was no longer being interpreted by people in front of them, but by an overlapping network of claims being processed elsewhere and projected back into this location as authority. Jack understood the shift immediately and corrected himself for the second time, stepping away from all visible markers and moving instead toward a position that broke direct alignment with both the cabin remains and the ridge lines, reducing his presence as a reference point rather than increasing it. This was not avoidance anymore, it was strategic invisibility within a system that was mapping them in real time. The riders did not advance or retreat, instead, their formation subtly reorganized again, but this time it was synchronized with something unseen, as if they were receiving instructions rather than making decisions. Mary revealed the final piece of information she had been withholding, that a satellite-assisted land verification scan had been scheduled months earlier for disputed territories in this region, and the collapse had accidentally triggered its activation window by exposing subsurface markers that matched archived survey coordinates. Jack realized then that the true conflict was no longer about ownership between individuals or even groups, but about which recorded version of the land would be accepted as authoritative by the system now evaluating it from above. He looked at the baby in Mary's arms and then at the broken cabin, understanding that everything he had done so far, including every attempt to protect or reposition, had already been absorbed into a larger dataset of actions being interpreted as evidence of intent. For the first time, Jack did not try to outthink the riders or the system behind them. Instead, he focused on stabilizing what little could still be controlled locally, which was not land, not claims, but perception at ground level. He instructed Mary to remain still and visible in a single consistent position, because inconsistency was now more dangerous than exposure, and he positioned himself at a calculated midpoint between all reference points so that no single interpretation could fully define him without contradiction. The pressure in the valley shifted again, but this time it was not from movement, it was from confirmation arriving somewhere unseen, and Jack understood that whatever decision would be made next would not come from the ground, but from the system that had just finished deciding what the ground meant. Jack Callahan stood in the snow-covered valley as the groups from both ridges finally descended. No guns were drawn. No voices were raised. Because everyone understood that this battle would not be decided by force. It would be decided by truth. Federal representatives arrived that afternoon. A temporary verification center was established beside the collapsed cabin. Mary Whitaker sat inside holding her baby. Jack stood beside her. For the first time since they had met, neither of them was running from anything. Old records were opened. Altered maps were compared. Long-lost documents were restored. And eventually, the truth emerged. There was no treasure buried beneath the cabin. No gold mine. No hidden fortune. Nothing capable of changing the world. What had been hidden for decades was a set of original survey records. Documents proving that the entire region had been transferred illegally many years ago. Some people had hidden the truth. Others had distorted it. But no one expected a winter storm to uncover it. When the final ruling was announced, ownership of the land was returned to the families who had lost it generations earlier. Among them was Mary's family. The baby in her arms was not heir to wealth, but heir to the truth. Several corporations lost control of the region. Numerous contracts were voided. Multiple officials resigned. But the most important outcome was that history was finally corrected. When everything was over, Mary stepped outside the verification tent. The snow had begun to melt across the hills. The baby slept peacefully in her arms. Jack was waiting outside. "You can leave now," Mary said softly. "This was never your fight." Jack looked toward the collapsed cabin. Then toward the child. Finally, he smiled. "Maybe it wasn't at first. But I think it is now." Mary laughed for the first time since they met. Spring arrived in Wyoming later than usual. But it arrived all the same. The old cabin was dismantled. A new home was built on the hill. Jack helped raise every wall. Mary planted wildflowers around the porch. And the child took his first steps on land no one fought over anymore. One evening, months later, Jack stood on the hill watching the sunset. Mary approached carrying the child. "Do you ever regret stopping that day?" she asked. Jack looked across the valley. At the house. At the fields. Then he shook his head. "If I had kept walking that morning, I might have missed this entire life." The evening wind moved gently through the grasslands. No more secrets. No more disputes. Only people who had finally found where they belonged. And for the first time in many years, the Wyoming Valley was truly at peace.